So much to talk about, so many questions. So let's get right to our panel. Joining us from Mexico City is Eric Olson. He's the Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. Manuel Suarez-Mier is in our Washington studio right next to me. He served as the Chief of Staff to the Governor of the Bank of Mexico and as Minister of Economic Affairs at the Mexican Embassy in Washington. Also with us from Mexico City is Nathaniel Parish Flannery. He's a writer and political analyst focusing on Latin America. And joining us via Skype from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, is the director of the Baker Institute's Mexico Center at Rice University, last but not least, Tony Payan. And Tony, I will begin with you. Lopez Obrador supporters call him the man of the people, someone who feels and understands what they have gone through the last decade or so. Opponents call him a dangerous populist. They have even compared him to Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. And it's pretty clear who and what the voters in Mexico believed.
Well, I think that Mr. Lopez Obrador, obviously, this is the third time he runs for the presidency of Mexico. And for a while, most Mexicans really didn't want him as president. They wanted to make sure that both the PRI and the PAN could provide an alternative to fight corruption, to end violence, and to get the economic system working for the people. In 2012, they even brought in Mr. Peña and gave the PRI a second chance to see if they could cut it after 12 years of Panista governments. And then they finally said, okay, looks like the system is not working. And the Lopez Obrador rise was also facilitated by the fact that the United States no longer considers Mexico a strategic partner, not the White House. And Mr. Lopez Obrador was able to read all these different signals quite well. I have said in the past that he played three cards very well. His populist card, his base, many of them waiting for opportunity, about a third of Mexicans that had left out of the economic and political system in the last two elections. And then he was very pragmatic, moving a little to the center and building a coalition that can descend a bit, but it will be complicated to keep together among these different parts of the PC as party. They're quite the opposite. And of course, he also played the nationalist card when he said that he would rescue the dignity of Mexicans from all the different attacks that Mr. Trump had carried out on Mexico. So it was his time. Everything was on his side. And here we are, Lopez Obrador with 53%.
And we're going to get to some of the issues you mentioned, like poverty, inequality, and corruption in just a moment. But Nathaniel, you call this vote one of the most critical elections in modern Mexican history. Explain to our viewers the magnitude of what just happened in Mexico. Someone from the left getting more than 50%, 53% of the vote.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very interesting question. I feel like AMLO's landslide victory really does a lot to expose some of the myth-making and marketing behind the idea of modern Mexico. During the NAFTA era, we've seen this idea that Mexico has fundamentally transformed from being a closed economy to a modern globalized society. And at the same time, there's a kind of idea that maybe cities like Mexico City or Monterrey are true global financial capitals. But at the same time, Mexico embraces its indigenous cultures and its history and its shared past. And I think that AMLO's election goes to show that that myth maybe doesn't stand up to reality. AMLO's election is a sign that national politicians' rhetoric is finally catching up with the reality that we see on the ground. 60% of Mexico's labor force works in the informal economy. If there's been a boom during the NAFTA era, most people in most parts of the country aren't feeling it. They aren't seeing it. What they are seeing in their neighborhoods are a scarcity of well-paying jobs, security problems, and every day in the news, they see countless scandals of political corruption. So we have a situation in Mexico where you have a high level of visibility of corruption and very little accountability. And AMLO's election is simply a sign that people have had enough and they're ready for a change, even if they're not quite sure exactly what that change will look like.
Well, let me go to Manuel and then to Eric. Do you agree with Nathaniel's assessment? People were just fed up. They said enough is enough. Eric, let me go to you first.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Listen, on election day, I was on the outskirts of Mexico City, Huitzilucan, which is the home of one of the most powerful political groups in Mexico, gave rise to President Salinas. The current president is married into some of these families. This is the bedrock of pre-support, the pre-machine. People bleed green, white, and red in Huitzilucan. And when they opened those presidential boxes and Morena and AMLO were winning 3-4 to 1, you knew something really profound was happening. I think he won in the north where Tony is. Those are not friendly territories for AMLO traditionally and usually, but he did well in northeast and the northwest. This is across the board, and I think there are some reasons to be concerned about what AMLO will do, but we do need to recognize that this is a tremendous political achievement, whether we like it or not, and that he now has a tremendous mandate to try to remake the country. He said he was entering in the fourth era of Mexican modern history. That's a big mantle to take for himself, but at this moment, it looks like at least he has the political following to try to do something like that.
So Manuel, Eric is saying reasons to be concerned, but a huge achievement here. What do you think about what our panel has said so far?
Well, it is, but partly it's a result of a four-way race, number one. Number two, it's part of the loss of prestige by the sitting government, and particularly President Peña Nieto. Many people feel disaffected by many of his policies and the results. But let's not fool ourselves. You said at the introduction that Lopez was a social democrat. No, he's a demagogue, an authoritarian demagogue. And all of his campaign promises have been vague. He never said how he would do anything.
We're going to get to that, Manuel, but the reality is he won this election by a huge mandate. So the majority of Mexicans would disagree with you.
That's what worries me, because he's also going to restore the old authoritarian regime of the 30s and 40s with the support of Congress, and then he'll try to neutralize the Supreme Court and the judicial system in order to restore the imperial presidency that lasted for many years. This is a restoration of the ancient reactionary pre.
Let me pose this question to all of you gentlemen, and let me begin with Tony again. Why do you think his message resonated with voters this time around? Lopez Obrador ran for election 2 other times, and he didn't get anywhere with it. And this time, he won, and he won big.
Well, without saying
I think we have to recognize that in two.
Excuse me, Eric. Tony was answering the question. I'll get to you in just a moment, please. Tony, go ahead.
You know, without saying that Mr. Lopez Obrador is any kind of savior, he is not. Without saying that he's a perfect man, he is not. And it's true that he was not very clear exactly as to how he was going to carry out his program, and he will have some important challenges: what to do about corruption, what to do about security, how to redistribute wealth and income in the country. Those are important challenges that are coming up. But there's 2 important things that we cannot forget here. Number one is this was not the result of a race. That would have he got 20% or 25, 29 or 30%. He got 53%. This was a clear mandate from those Mexicans who actually understood what he represented, who actually went to the polls in a very peaceful way. I was an observant in many of the different precincts here in Ciudad Juarez, and I can tell you there was not a single incident. Everything went well. So I don't agree that this is a pre-modern Mexico coming back up and recovering the OP and so on. No, this is I think an important victory for Mr. Lopez Obrador. He now has a mandate to demonstrate that he truly can address these issues. There are 2 stories here that are important. One expected, which is his win by 53%, a clear majority mandate. But another important story is the collapse of the PRI, the PRI that governed Mexico for so long and got a second wind, a second chance in 2012, and now was beaten out of almost every single elected post in the country, didn't get a single governorship, and will now have just a handful of senators a small number of members of Congress, and of course, in the states, if you look at the elections in every state.
Tony, okay, go ahead quickly,
sorry.
please, because I want to give our other guests a chance to interject. So finish thought.
No, I said the priest. There's a second story that the priest loses them all.
Eric, you and Nathaniel, I saw you shaking your head. Let's start with you, Manuel. Do you want to respond to Tony?
Well, yes, it's precisely the reason why I'm very worried, and many people are very worried, because this mandate means that he will yield power by himself. He doesn't have any checks and balances.
Eric, Nathaniel, does he have any checks and balances? Eric, go ahead.
Well, no, I disagree. I disagree entirely. There are checks and balances. What's different now is that you have an active and independent press. You have a civil society. To think that the only power in Mexico is in electoral office is to miss the bigger picture of the country, how it's moved to be a more plural and open democracy. I agree with Tony. The danger here is that the PAN has the PRI has collapsed. The PAN itself is in real jeopardy, being divided and not doing well. Are those parties going to take the right lesson from this, learn from it, understand that they have to fight corruption, not just cover it up the way the PRI did? If the only response of the elite is to call Andrés Manuel a demagogue and not learn the lessons, then I think they themselves will be extinct before the next election comes around. They have to start learning from their own mistakes, and simply calling people bad names and fear-mongering is not the answer.
All right, well, let's get into specifics here.
It is a very bad name, and it's not based on anything.
And Nathaniel,
Rubbish.
let's move on, gentlemen. Let's talk about concrete proposals. What has Lopez Obrador put on the table to fix some of the country's problems? One of his big priorities, inequality. And this question is for Nathaniel. A fact here, more than 50 million of the country's 128 million people live below the poverty line. Only 1% of the country's population holds a third of its wealth. So what is Lopez Obrador, or AMLO, going to do about inequality? Has anyone heard any specific proposals? Nathaniel.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. Inequality is one of the, I would say, the top 3 defining characteristics of modern Mexico. And it's going to be one of the biggest issues during AMLO's sexennial, and to be honest, probably afterwards. During the last 20 years, per capita income growth in Mexico has basically been flat in real terms, while the wealthiest families in the country have seen their income increase 5-fold. So the degree of concentration of wealth that we see in Mexico is really hard to understand for people, looking at it from the U.S. But that being said, the solution to inequality is hard to find. Obviously, one of the easiest ways is to promote robust economic growth and to solidify and create a real middle class in Mexico. In most cities in Mexico, in most states in Mexico, most people earn only a few $1,000s a year. The idea that there's a middle class in Jalisco or in Baja California is largely a myth. It's really only a few thousand families that are earning over $10,000 a year, and in the country as a whole, the wealthiest 10% earns over about $40,000 a year. It's hard to look at that dynamic and say that there's a real middle class, but AMLO faces a lot of challenges. He's promised a lot, and he's going to have to turn his campaign rhetoric into pragmatic policy, and we're still waiting to see exactly what that's going to look like.
So from poverty, corruption, and fighting violence, boy, the figures there are absolutely staggering. More than 25,000 people killed in Mexico last year, the most violent on record, and 2018 is expected to be even worse. Another major topic here is the economy. Big, daunting challenge there. Let's listen to Lopez Obrador, what he said after he won the election and what he said about the status of the economy.
No habrá necesidad.
There will be no need to increase taxes in real terms, nor for the country to fall into debt. There will also be no hikes in petrol. I will lower the general cost of living and the public investment to propel productive activities and to create jobs. The objective is to strengthen the internal market, to try to produce what we consume in the country.
So, Eric, you heard what he had to say. How is he going to do this? How is he going to turn the economy around?
I think those are very good questions. I would remind people that most presidential elections, including those in the United States and in Latin America, aren't won or lost over detailed proposals, but broader issues.
Okay, maybe not
agree.
detailed
It would
proposals,
be nice to know
but how
specific,
about some kind of proposal?
So last night he said, and I talked to international bankers today, that he gave all the right signals. He doesn't want to increase the federal debt. He doesn't want to do extra spending, not increase taxes. You know, we can question whether we believe it or not, but he's trying to say the right things, to say that within the context of standard economic procedures, the macroeconomic stability that has existed here for the last, 2 decades, he wants to shift the emphasis of the government of policy, but leaving that general architecture, if you will, in place. Again, we can question whether that's real, whether it's going to happen, but what he said last night was very reassuring to the markets, very reassuring to traders in terms of currency. The peso did not fluctuate a great deal today, and they have been going out of the way to reassure. And I think realistically that's what they can be expected to do at this point.
Well, before we move on to U.S. relations, Manuel is shaking his head next to me. Manuel, go ahead.
That is not going to last.
What is not going to last?
The rosy scenario painted by Mr. Olson, an instant gringo who goes to Mexico and becomes an instant expert on Mexican affairs, okay. The issue here is add up all the promises that he has made, and there's no money to finance that. At the same time, he wants to reduce the price of gasoline. Who is that a transfer for the rich? At the same time, he promises not to raise taxes. So you add up what he has promised to spend and his sources of revenue, and they don't match. He says that he's going to get 500 billion pesos out of less corruption. By the way, he's surrounded by some of the most corrupt people in the country. And I could name 20 right now.
It sounds like his predecessors had the same problem.
Yeah, but he has been collecting corrupt people all over the place, including Napoleon Gomez Urrutia, who stole 55 million from mining workers and has lived in exile in Canada. He's going to make him senator.
Okay, Manuel, let's put a pause on that. Let's put a period there and move on to the important relationship Mexico has with the United States, a relationship that has not always in recent months, I should say since Donald Trump took office, has had its share of low points. Let's listen to what Obrador said. And by the way, President Trump did call Lopez Obrador and they spoke on the phone for 30 minutes. But before that conversation, this is what President-elect had to say.
We will pursue a relationship of friendship and cooperation with the United States, always rooted in mutual respect and in the defense of our fellow Mexicans who live and work honorably in that country.
Tony, what is the status of this relationship moving forward? Is there going to be more confrontation, or are things going to get better?
Well, this is a very important question. This was one of the greatest doubts that we all had. But here's what I think is going to happen. I think Mr. Lopez Obrador is not, by definition, anti-American. He has said very little about the United States, very little about Americans. And all he has said is that Mr. Trump will not treat Mexico like a piñata. That means he demands respect from the United States, and that's it. But I think Mr. Lopez Obrador is actually quite aware how intertwined the United States and Mexico are, the importance of Mexican immigrants in the United States. He understands the importance of American investment in Mexico, and he understands that he's going to have to rely on that investment to produce jobs. I think that this is an interesting combination. I was thinking about that the other day, and let's take NAFTA, for example. it could be that under Mr. Lopez Obrador and Mr. Trump, there may be a resolution to NAFTA. I mean, if you think about wages, for example, Mr. Trump says that there has been wage suppression in Mexico and he wants Mexican wages to rise. Mr. Lopez Obrador wants Mexican wages to rise.
I agree.
So, check. Mr. Lopez Obrador has clearly said that he's more nationalistic. He certainly could believe and could buy into the idea that the dispute resolution mechanisms could be national. And there's a number of issues like that.
All right, well, let's focus on the U.S. part and NAFTA now, gentlemen. So Eric, Nathaniel, and Manuel, will this NAFTA deal have a better chance, the renegotiation of NAFTA, now that Lopez Obrador or AMLO has won the election? Manuel, you go ahead.
Of course not. There's no chance that the deal will be finished anytime soon because the U.S. is setting conditions that make it impossible. But look what Lopez Obrador has proposed. He's proposing to go back to the 60s, an alliance for progress. He has mentioned this specifically. Alliance for progress for Mexico and Central America. He has proposed that Mexico should be the conduit of all the immigrants of the world to come to the U.S. I mean, these ideas are completely cockeyed and will confront him directly with Trump.
Eric, do you want to respond to that?
I agree that reaching a final agreement on NAFTA will be extraordinarily difficult. There are many difficult issues ahead. The fact that President Trump wants to use it as part of his election campaign in November, doesn't want a deal before that so that he can show his base that he's being tough. The fact that Andrés Manuel also understands that he wants a deal that's going to benefit his base, his constituency, I think those make it very difficult for them to be pragmatic and find solutions. At the end of the day, however, I think the economies of the U.S. and Mexico are so intertwined, they depend on each other so much that they will come to some kind of agreement unless one or the other insists on impossible agreements or details that the other just can't swallow.
Nathaniel, you have the last word. You have about 15 seconds.
Okay. All I can say, it's going to be fascinating to see what actually happens once Trump starts to enter into a dialogue with AMLO. I think he might have finally met a rival who can challenge him on Twitter, who can invent great nicknames, and who can hopefully push the relationship forward.
Our thanks to Nathaniel Parish Flannery, Eric Olson, Tony Payan, and Manuel Suarez-Mier in the studio with me. Thank you so much. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.